I'm going to start out by just talking about the image that's on the screen here. This was taken in the summer of 2005 in the meeting room of the Doig River First Nations Band Hall, which is in northeastern British Columbia, just outside of Fort St. John. And I want to describe what's going on in it because it's, what's going on in this image evokes some of the themes and the concepts that I'll come back to a couple times in the course of the presentation. It was a really exciting moment for me because it was the very beginning of a production process of a Virtual Museum of Canada exhibit about Daneza stories and songs, which was co-curated eventually by a folklorist named Amber Riddington and worked on with a large group of linguistic anthropologists, folklorists, ethnographers, and then a lot of community participation from elders and youth and so on. So in this picture, a group of elders and project participants had just gathered in the boardroom, and the chief at that time, named Gary Oker, had just unfolded this cloth bundle which contained a moose hide, a painted moose hide drum skin that had been created by a Daneza dreamer about 100 years before. And the drum skin had come into Gary Oker's possession through his family. So he just unwrapped this drum, and this elder named Tommy Atachi is looking at it, and he's talking about it, and I'm recording what he's saying on video. Now, in my work with the Doig River First Nation over the last 5 or 6 years, maybe longer now, I realize, I've learned that dreamers were people who were said to travel to heaven in their dreams and bring back songs and prophecies that provide moral guidance and spiritual guidance. And Daneza oral tradition, they predicted the coming of white settlers to the Peace River region and also the industrialization of this very oil-rich landscape. And the last known dreamer was named Charlie Yahe, who passed away in 1976. So the songs that these dreamers brought back from heaven are still performed today by drummers and singers in the community. Tommy Atachi is known as a song keeper. He remembers all of these songs, and he's worked with young people to revive those singing traditions at Doig River, and then they perform them throughout northern BC. So this is some of the context. Some of these dreamers also painted their visions of heaven on these moose hide maps. So Tommy is using the drum to talk about the history of Daneza dreamers and the ways in which they've helped Daneza people navigate life under colonialism, and articulating the many ways that the drum is connected to oral traditions, to the revitalization of the Daneza language, and also knowledge of the land. But for me, the photograph also represents this really key tension in the documentation of material culture and intangible cultural heritage. And this is where this duct tape comes in that I've put on here. This is a nod to Kimberly Christian's project, Digital Dynamics Across Cultures, where she's used duct tape to cover up images that have been decided to be removed from circulation, particularly after someone has passed away and their image shouldn't be seen. So this draws attention to those cultural protocols. I've covered up the drum here because even though it became central to the way that the exhibit process and the content for our virtual museum project took shape, eventually the Doig River chief and council decided that this drum should not be seen publicly. So this digitally documented moment represented a significant transition from very locally managed intangible knowledge to digital cultural heritage. Now, of course, many Canadian First Nations and Aboriginal organizations here and around the world are using digital media to revitalize languages and to assert control over the representation of their cultures. And there's just a few examples here that I know you can't see very clearly, but from the Warramungu people who are working with Kim Christian to develop cultural protocol-based digital archives in Australia, to Zuni projects aimed at reconnecting narratives to objects in the Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. That's a Ramesh Srinivasan project, to Isuma TV, which is the Zach Kunick Indigenous Video Hub, to so many different projects kind of show the range of the way people are mobilizing these tools. Also, a lot of academic institutions, museums, and individual researchers are embracing these technologies for their ability to make the collections widely visible. We're seeing how material culture is being digitally photographed for online collections databases, and then documentation of intangible heritage like film, video, audio recordings, digital files are also being transformed into the digital heritage. So really these technologies are allowing members of originating communities to access widely dispersed documentation of their material and cultural and linguistic heritage, sometimes for the first time. So this is really amounting to a paradigm shift in the way that access can be created, but also the ways in which First Nations and Aboriginal communities and organizations can access and integrate these collections into their own media practices. So they're opening up a lot of possibilities for sharing ethnographic authority, but also facilitating self-expression. Now, visual access to, by these communities to digital collections is often talked about as virtual or digital repatriation. So in my work, I've been trying to think about the sort of opportunities associated with this idea, but also the critiques and the sort of disadvantages or problems that might be associated with thinking about it this way. Again, Kim Christian has written about how these practices really raise important questions about the ownership and the control of heritage once it's been transformed into the digital. She says part of the inclusion of new technologies in these ventures is about maintaining control, both technological and social, over how knowledge is cataloged, circulated, and cultivated. So this is what I've been trying to think about in the projects that I've been working on. Now, Lawrence Lessig, of course, I'm sure you all know Lawrence Lessig, and we're using Creative Commons for licensing our work these days, reminds us that, of course, digital code, which at its most primary function makes copies, has really displaced this, the natural duplication constraints of analog media. And this has been a problem for people who are trying to limit rather than circulate their media while they're engaged in conservation and revitalization activities. Our computers are now simultaneously these tools for the production of media, but also the distribution of media. And this is really creating a shift away from what was formerly locally controlled and mediated forms of knowledge to this unrestricted circulation, appropriation, and remix. Now, further, in relation to this idea of virtual repatriation, unlike the repatriation of material culture or human remains to originating communities or individuals, it's very rare that the ownership of digital heritage is actually transferred from the copyright holders to the communities of origin when it's given. So often we're seeing copies given, but not actually control over copyright. Smithsonian curators have called this a middle ground of repatriation. So what I've been trying to figure out, drawing on Jennifer Kramer's work here in the anthropology department and at the Museum of Anthropology, she's asked if the desire for repatriation is the desire to control representation as individuals and as First Nations, then I wonder how does virtual repatriation by institutions or by individuals support or actually thwart the efforts of First Nations peoples or Aboriginal peoples to represent themselves. So a little overview of what I'm just going to go through today. I'm going to talk about two perspectives on the repatriation of cultural property that I've been exploring in relation to virtual repatriation and these associated community media projects that are negotiating this tension between access, self-representation, control, and circulation. I'm going to talk about the notion of remediation in relation to the Virtual Museum of Canada exhibit, Dane Wajich, Dane's Stories and Songs, Dreamers and the Land, that I co-curated with members of the Doig River First Nation and also Amber Riddington. I'll then talk about the idea of fragmentation and how it relates to digitization initiatives in relation to a project based here at the Museum of Anthropology called the Reciprocal Research Network. And based on the Reciprocal Research Network, a current project that's under production producing a virtual exhibit with the Inuvialuit Cultural Resource Center in Inuvik and the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History in Washington. So remediation might be a little bit small for you to see up there, but I'm quoting Gary Oker, who we worked with in the Dog River First Nation. He's asserting here that the repatriation of cultural heritage, both tangible or intangible, is a tool for him and in his community for self-representation and expression of identity. So he's interested in reusing these tangible or intangible repatriated artifacts in a way that points to some possibilities for media practices associated with the return of these digital collections to remediate products of colonial collecting and ethnographic research practices. So the idea that he could take media that's been recorded in another context and recontextualize it in relation to contemporary local practices. So this brings me to this work with the Dog River First Nation, which was the core of my doctoral research. So here, I've been thinking about these possibilities and problems associated with the remediation and the digitization of intangible heritage. This is just a map. You can see the Dog River First Nation is just that little red dot just northeast of Fort St. John in the northeastern corner of BC. And in recent years, this has become a huge oil and gas production area. So it's very common to see oil wells and smell gas and that sort of thing in that area. There's a community of Danezat people at the Dog River First Nation. They settled here around 1950 after their reserve at a place called Montney, which is just outside of Fort St. John, was kind of underhandedly sold to the Department of Veterans Affairs for returning war veterans to settle. And I don't have time to go into the details, but between 1975 and 2004, the Dog River and the Blueberry bands fought in court for compensation for the Montney Reserve subsurface mineral rights, which should have been held in trust by the federal government for the band, which had been instead inadvertently transferred to the settlers. So they had a significant settlement, luckily, which created opportunities for the community. So for example, they were able to use a little bit of that money to construct a new band hall, which provided administrative infrastructure for a range of culture and language and media projects, one of which was the digitization of a collection of documentation of intangible cultural heritage from Danezat communities that was collected by an anthropologist named Robin Riddington and his colleagues over the last 40 years. So this archive became extremely valuable to Danezat communities because, as Dr. Riddington puts it, what seemed unremarkable and sort of everyday at the time they recorded it became extremely important and remarkable today. So at the time of digitization, the archive included around 5,000 photographs, 600 hours of audio, and 60 hours of digital videotape. And it really documents people, places, oral traditions, language, and was particularly focused on this last dreamer, Charlie Yahe, who passed away around 1976. And I started my research there because I was interested in following how these newly digitized elements of intangible heritage would be used in the community, and what this might say for researchers and also other First Nations who are thinking about this as a form of repatriation or thinking about this as opening up possibilities for their own cultural work. So with folklorist Amber Riddington, the community applied for a grant from the Virtual Museum of Canada to create an exhibit of stories and songs that would facilitate learning how to access this new digital archive, but would also provide media production training for youth and would support the band in its effort to represent themselves to the surrounding community, industry, government, and also people around the world. And this became the Danewajich project. We were really focused on this project as having a very open participatory process. So we didn't have a very clear vision of how the production or this exhibit would unfold. We took about 2 years after the initial production to go through a review process with community members and to get feedback at each stage of the exhibition. So we worked with youth and elders for video training. Now, the first image that I showed you with the Dreamer's drum unwrapped, where Tommy Atachi was talking about that drum, this was really the point where our production process opened up. Basically, when Gary Oker revealed that drum to our group, elders at the meeting recognized it. They identified it as having been created by another dreamer called Gayen, and they identified the painting on it as Gayen's vision of heaven and a representation of the Daneza creation story, and that it was an important teaching tool for young people. So Tommy Atachi, sort of the day after that first picture that I showed you was taken, spoke very eloquently in Daneza Zage about the drum as a way to connect the community process of documenting contemporary stories to Daneza history. So this video, which I won't show you today, but I'm happy to direct you to the site if you're interested in watching these videos. In this video, we felt that it was an important document to be a part of our exhibit to demonstrate the process and the way this particular drum opened up a process in which sort of intangible knowledge could be connected to this particular object and also to the land. Because what Tommy did was instruct elders and youth to travel out into places in the landscape, and that had been seasonal hunting and gathering sites, campsites, places where Daneza prophets, who were members of people's families today, and important hunt chiefs had also camped and preached to people, led a kind of a dance called a tea dance, and particular places where dreamers had actually dreamt these songs from heaven, and even places where they had died and been buried. So these were identified in the course of this open process, and then we traveled out to those places, really attempting to connect this history of Daneza dreamers, the continuity of song traditions and oral traditions. So we identified Daneza dreamers and showed, created pages that would teach people about their history. And as I mentioned before, a lot of the songs are still performed by groups of drummers today at Doig River. One of the places that we filmed video narratives for was this reserve called Montney, which had been the former summer reserve of the band. Now, when Daneza people from all over used to gather in the summer, they would gather for tea dances, and they would gather to meet with these dreamers, like the dreamer Gayen, who had created this drum. It's also the place where Gayen is buried. So our group went out to look for the grave, but also to record stories there about the community's history there. So the exhibit has, say, video of an elder named Mayab Sasson talking about what she remembers being there as a child, but also, Jerry Atachi was the chief of the Doig River First Nation through their long battle for a compensation over these mineral rights. And he gives a history of that particular court case and what it's meant for the band. So all in all, at the end of this process, we had about 25 different videos that told stories of the Daneza region in relation to dreamers and that particular drum. And those newly recorded videos and photographs of our process sat alongside archival recordings of songs from the Riddington archive. These are some of the songs. And then we also worked with linguists to translate all of these narratives so that the site could also be a resource for language revitalization and language learning. So that, I described that to give you a sense of how this exhibit was produced and what it included. But I want to now just talk about a couple of the outcomes of the project, which I'm calling here digital matters. Now, while I'm describing them in relation to the specific ethnographic examples from Doig River, I feel like they speak to broader issues at play in the study of anthropology and media, heritage, and ethics. Here, we really had to come to terms with some of the outcomes of making formerly limited documentation of Daneza intangible heritage and tangible cultural heritage public over the internet. So this first matter relates to the centrality of cultural protocols and the ethics of managing digital heritage. Now, after this summer that we spent filming, storyboarding, deciding what videos would be included, translating, collecting images, and searching the archive, people originally chose to put that very image of Gayen's drum that had been so central to our process on the homepage of the virtual exhibit. But almost as soon as we started circulating this image around, we started to hear that, well, okay, so the story goes like this. We put the image of this drum skin that Tommy Atachi used to tell our story, but people started to be worried that we shouldn't show an image, or an image of a drum that was damaged. So instead, an image was chosen from the archive of the dreamer Charlie Yahe holding a different drum, also by the dreamer Gayen. However, when we started to circulate that image on the homepage of our exhibit to communities and to people within the community, we heard that there was resistance from a neighboring community, also a Daneza community where descendants of Charlie Yahe lived, that the Doig River First Nation should not be using that particular image. So they asserted that families should be able to assert and enforce their intellectual property rights to images of their relatives. And even more, this drum was still in the possession of the grandsons of Charlie Yahe, and they did not feel that it was proper for it to be shown without their permission. So this is some of the tension between ethnographic documentation and digitization and the making public of this kind of media. At the same time, at Doig River, when discussion turned to repairing that drum skin and making an exhibit in their own community museum, Amber Riddington and I were quite surprised to hear from some elders that that could only happen if the drum was covered up completely, like wrapped up in a blanket, so that people couldn't actually see it when it was on exhibit. So we started to wonder what this meant for the virtual exhibit, which had used this image quite extensively in a community process of decision making. So Amber and I then went on a little mission to talk to as many people as we could about whether or not something that should be limited in a real context actually translated into the digital context. Could an image of this be seen on the internet if you couldn't actually see or touch the object for particular cultural reasons? Young people didn't see that this was as much of a problem, but some older people thought that we should not show this image publicly. So all of these images of drums were removed from the exhibit, and in accordance with the wishes of the descendants of Charlie Yahe, we also took down all the images of Charlie Yahe that were on this site. And we decided to replace these images with the drums that are used by the Doig River drummers today, which don't have paintings on them because they're not dreamers dreaming these visions of heaven to be painted these days. So these are the drums that would be used by people before and now, but they're not dreamers' drums. They're drums that these people are performing with. So these are perhaps a more a clear representation of the way that these songs are performed today. The second matter that I'll talk about, it has to do with control. So even though a decision was made to remove pictures of the drum and to remove images of Charlie Yahe from our project, the fact that they had been digitized made them actually very difficult to remove from the internet. My work with the Doig River First Nation has really shown that there's this ethical paradox that while visual data that's used in these new media contexts can generate articulations of intellectual property rights and can raise awareness about ownership and some of the cultural protocols that might be important to consider in relation to making digital work public, they also, at the same time, amplify the difficulty of enforcing those rights once they've been articulated. So, for example, even though the Doig River chief and the community made decisions about the way that sacred material culture and its digital representation should be restricted, an online search still reveals some of these images in different manifestations and sort of remixed states. So for example, there was a Treaty 8 website that had a sort of remixed collage of Charlie Yahe in its banner. There were videos made in the course of the digitization of the archive, which are available, which show these drums. And I was interested to see that, there's a young person at a BC Provincial Heritage Fair who has downloaded the very image that we removed from our site from somewhere else, who's able to incorporate it into their project. So it's quite readily available, it seems. I also saw that images from the archive had been reinterpreted and remixed to serve other purposes and maybe ideological agendas. Here to advertise travel along the Alaska highways. A respected late drummer named Charlie Dominic, who has many family members at Doig River, was used to advertise the North Peace. But the next year, I saw that he'd been sort of remixed into the background and the RV had been made more prominent. So these images, on the one hand, have the potential to draw attention to the vibrant life of First Nations in that community, but they can be easily sent into the background as well. So for me, in this work, there was a deeper irony related to the effects of virtual repatriation of Daneza heritage. So I talked about before how descendants of Charlie Yahe at the neighboring Blueberry Reserve had cared for the drum made by Gayen, the one that was in the photograph with Charlie Yahe. They've been keeping it out of public circulation in accordance with what they've been taught about that drum, but it was the documentation by anthropologists and its digitization and its circulation that actually most compromised their ability to determine how that drum should be viewed in accordance with their own protocols. So if, back to Jennifer Kramer, if the desire for repatriation is this desire for control over representation as individuals and as First Nations, then in this case, perhaps the virtual repatriation or digitization practices that don't, from the very beginning, consider local protocols for the circulation of cultural heritage might undermine these very good intentions. Instead of facilitating greater control over representation, these practices might actually exacerbate the fragmentation or the remix of the documentation itself. So that's one context, a context in which ethnographic documentation had been archived, protected, and had been in fairly limited circulation. Dr. Riddington has maintained a very close relationship with people at Doig River and Daneza people more broadly, so he would create access to the archive before it became digital. This is very different from the project that I'm working on now, which aims to bring Inuvialuit communities in the Western Arctic in contact with a Smithsonian collection called the Mcfarland Collection at the National Museum of Natural History. So this is a context in which the collection has been in the possession of the Smithsonian for the last 130, 140 years, and it's been a public collection which has not been exhibited extensively, but the records have been available online, and it's been a Smithsonian founding collection. So the dynamic of being made open is a different one. We're starting from a point where the collection is public, and we're trying to bring it back to the community. I should just say this is a project that is working with the Reciprocal Research Network here at the Museum of Anthropology, and also with the Inuvialuit Cultural Resource Center. And we have some funding from the iPinch Intellectual Property Issues and Cultural Heritage project, which is based out of Simon Fraser University. So for this project, I'm thinking about this idea of fragmentation. While the Daneza example suggested that digitization might actually, in some way, exacerbate fragmentation, we're looking at the way a project like the Reciprocal Research Network actually addresses the problem of fragmentation of cultural heritage and how it can connect people and collections again. So here in this quotation, Emma Tamlin from Alert Bay is saying, I hope that someday before I leave this world, that I see a lot of, all of our stuff come back, because I hear we've got things all over the world, and why did we lose it? What really happened? She, I think, really articulates the dismay that a lot of people feel about the fragmentation of their cultural heritage into dispersed international, institutional, and private collections, and the desire to understand why this happened and to find those collections. So digital visual access to museum collections is thought of as one way for people to locate material culture from their communities and make sense of the ways in which colonial authorities, museum collectors, and anthropologists have named, archived, and exhibited material culture and intangible heritage documentation. And for me, the Reciprocal Research Network is a great example of a project that's aiming to deal directly with these legacies of fragmentation. So it's being co-developed by the Musqueam Indian Band, the Stolo Nation and Stolo Tribal Council, and the Umista Cultural Society and the Museum of Anthropology here at UBC. It was just launched last spring, and it's basically a community, a collaboratively designed web portal that allows visual access to dispersed Northwest Coast collections in partnering museum institutions. So from the Royal BC Museum here to the American Museum of Natural History, to the Oxford Pitt Rivers Museum, there's a large group of museums who have contributed their data so that people can access those collections. Of course, to do this without the RRN, you'd have to search each of these collections individually. They're very different systems, and it's quite prohibitive. The RRN allows researchers and originating community members to collaborate with one another in a reciprocal exchange of knowledge over the web through social networking and data contribution. Okay, so let me go to here. So basically, this is just a screenshot of the RRN where you can see that objects in the collections can be searched in many different ways. And I'm not going to demonstrate it here, but I encourage you, if you're not already members or haven't already seen the RRN, to go and have a look at it. So for example, you can search for objects. You can view object records. And you can see, for example, here, this is the data that the RRN has mapped from in this case, this is an object from the Smithsonian. But you can also see the data as the Smithsonian represents it. So there are two different ways of viewing object information. You can see images that are of the objects with a few different views and quite high resolution. And you can see, in this case, a direct scan of the Smithsonian's record. You can also connect with other researchers by, say, asking a question to other members of the Reciprocal Research Network here. And then you can also share your knowledge if you're so inclined. So if you have a question about a particular record, or if you're someone who's from a community who is connected to a particular object, you may have knowledge or particular correction to make, because often these records are not extremely accurate. So there's an interesting and very promising exchange of knowledge and ability to communicate and connect across institutions and within communities that the RRN provides. So in the last couple of years, this project, which we'll call the Inuvialuit Living History Project, has been emerging. Back in November 2009, a group of Inuvialuit elders and youth and sort of cultural specialists were taken. This is organized by an archaeologist named Natasha Lyons, who is at UBC Okanagan teaching and is an independent archaeology company. She's been working in the Nunavut region for a long time with this group of people, and she's been connecting with Stephen Loring at the Arctic Studies Center at the Smithsonian. They came to the Smithsonian, we all went together to look at a collection called the Mcfarland Collection, and to actually engage with the collection over a week. So this was the first time that Inuvialuit people had visited the collection. And when we left, the group felt very strongly that there should be a way for other Inuvialuit people to connect with these objects that represent their cultural heritage and their knowledge. So we went to the RRN because they're a partner, and we asked if, in addition to the Northwest Coast collections that they'd already contributed, they could contribute data for the Mcfarland Collection. So then we were able to use the RRN as a kind of hub for getting our project off the ground. And we wanted to be able to use the data that the Smithsonian had created and offered through the RRN for an Inuvialuit-based virtual museum project that would tell the story of this collection and then its ongoing life from an Inuvialuit perspective. So this is actually some of the objects that I showed you this slide before, but these are some of the kinds of skin clothing, tools, et cetera, that we can see streamed from the Smithsonian. And we are able to look at what the Smithsonian knows about those objects. And then in the course of our project, team members have been developing curatorial information that speaks to a more Inuvialuit sense of what those objects might be. Now we're in the very kind of early drafting stage of a project called Inuvialuit Living History that will stream data from the RRN into this Inuvialuit virtual exhibit and to rethink some of the identifiers for particular objects. So rethinking what kinds of materials are listed, manufacturing techniques, Inuvialuit terms, but also perhaps different tags and identifiers that will allow people to search these collections in a different way. So we'll be adding various tags that would allow us to develop educational programs and interesting ways of relating these media to each other. This is very early draft, but for example, snow goggles, a record with, that has to do with snow goggles, would then relate to images of our trip to the Smithsonian, other media, videos, and community productions that illustrate the ongoing life of that object today for Inuvialuit people. And also, there's been a strong interest in relating objects and media to particular places for people. This just gives you a little sense of what we're working on. We've just developed this draft for our first consultation, and Mervyn Joe here, who is a really core part of our project, who works at Parks Canada in Inuvik, just went with Natasha Lyons and Albert Elias on a trip through Inuvik and Tuk to schools to review this project, to collect feedback, to show people our book of artifacts from this collection, and to get feedback on these early mock-ups of a site so that this can be a useful tool for community members. As I mentioned before, an important part of the exhibit is the creation of school curriculum, which includes the recreation of objects from the collection, and also the development potentially of video projects that relate the use of these objects to contemporary practices on the land. So this is really in process and ongoing, and we hope in June to be able to launch the website with our team in Inuvik. Now, in both of these museum projects that I've been describing, it's been my intention to really point out the importance of control in the way that knowledge is managed and circulated. And I think while one context demonstrated the challenges associated with making a mostly private collection public, the other hints at the potential associated with making a public collection part of everyday life again, and a resource for community remediation, even in lieu of physical repatriation of the collection at that time. Although this has been an important part of discussions as people see and engage with that Smithsonian collection. So that really brings me to the end of my presentation. I just want to thank all of the many, many people who have been part of these projects. So I'm one person in two projects which have a lot of participants. And I've been very excited and happy to participate in these. But I just want to acknowledge especially Amber Riddington for the Danewadjich project, and Natasha Lyons and Kathy Cockney at the Inuvialuit Cultural Resource Center for the Inuvialuit project. And I'm very interested to hear your comments, and thanks for listening.